Good afternoon, everyone. I hope all of you are doing well, and welcome back to UNSW ASEAN Conference 2021. My name is Darman, and I'll be moderating our today's discussion on protecting migrants and workers from exploitation. We will explore the complexity of labor rights violations, roles of multiple stakeholders in ASEAN, and also the prevention of unfair treatments to workers during business recovery from COVID-19. Our endgame into this discussion is a better understanding from various perspectives and solid commitment to support migrants and workers' protections in ASEAN. All right, we got that. So how are we going to do it? So let me explain a brief structure of our discussion. First, I will introduce our panelist speakers and their backgrounds, then followed by discussion on several key questions. Finally, we will answer your questions, which you can write anytime on the platform provided. And to spice things up, we will feature a quiz and also interesting case study. Okay, so let's start our session now. We are so lucky today to have 4 distinct speakers who represent multiple perspectives in our discussion, from academia to business stakeholders and governmental institutions. First, we have His Excellency Eric Paulsen, the representative of Malaysia to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, or AICHR, 2019 till 2021. He co-founded Lawyers for Liberty in 2011, a human rights organization in Malaysia, and was its advisor until becoming the executive director from 2014 to June 2018. He has represented human rights defenders, government opposition activists, and elected representatives in numerous criminal and strategic litigation cases on freedoms of speech and assembly. He also previously worked with the UN agencies in Cambodia, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Myanmar on various human rights issues, particularly on statelessness and the Rohingya. Hello, Eric. Thank you so much for joining us today. Next, we also have Ms. Joyce Zhao, Amphory Director Asia Pacific, an international business association representing over 2,400 buyers, brands, and retailers from over 40 countries with the aim to drive sustainable trade through the building of responsible global supply chains. Based in Hong Kong, Joyce leads the APAC team covering Australian, New Zealand, and also key sourcing markets such as Bangladesh, Greater China, India, Turkey, and ASEAN countries. Her role is to drive trade with sustainability purpose through services on business social compliance via Amphory BSCI, environmental performance through Amphory BEPI, and also the trade policy, Amphory Advocacy. Hello, Joyce. Hope you're doing well now. We also got Dr. Stephen Morse, the founder and the CEO of Unchained Solutions, a consultancy that inspires Australian companies to be leaders in making an impact on modern slavery, based in Macquarie Park, New South Wales. Known for his depth of insight, unique perspective, and engaging presence, Stephen draws upon lessons learned from his practical experience in leadership and his doctoral research, which he completed in 2016 through the Fuller Theological Seminary, whilst based in Madrid, Spain. Through Unchained, Stephen is now providing training and diagnostic services to help corporate clients implement the Modern Slavery Act 2018. Hi, Stephen. How are you today?
Well, thanks. Great to be here.
Very nice. And Professor Justin Nolan, a professor at UNSW Law and the director of the Australian Human Rights Institute. She has published widely on business and human rights, including her 2019 co-author book titled Addressing Modern Slavery. She advises companies, NGOs, and governments on these issues and is a member of the Australian government's expert advisory body on modern slavery. Justin has practiced as a private sector and international human rights lawyer. Hello, Justin. We are looking forward to seeing your perspective today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right. As we can see, our speakers today have various backgrounds, and this will bring good balance on our discussion. Cool. So before we start the discussion, let's do some warming up exercises for our brain. We have prepared several questions to all of the audience about protecting migrants and workers from exploitation. So let's see how well you understand this topic. Okay, so first question. You're going to see the poll on the right side of your screen, but I'm going to read it as well. The first question would be the number of international migrants in ASEAN. Is it A, 6.9 million, or B, 7.9 million, C, 9.9 million, or D, 12.1 million? We'll give you 10 seconds to think about it, and let's see how well the audience understand about this topic. All right, so most of the audience chose 12.1 million, and the correct answer is 9.9 million. I know perhaps all of the audience think that the larger number would be the right answer, but yeah, that's it. Okay, so the second questions. Let's see. This is the problems experienced by migrant workers, the potential problems experienced by migrant workers. The first one, lacks benefits in terms of insurance, pension, or is it harsh working conditions and treatments, B? Or C, language and cultural problems, D, coercions, or E, all of them? So this is really fundamental questions because we are going to talk about migrant workers a lot in this discussion. So we are wondering about whether the audience understand about the problems that might be experienced. Let's see, another 10 seconds. Okay, so now the audience seems to really smart. So most of them chose all of the above, which is a correct answer. Really nice, really nice. Cool. All right. So the third questions. Here are the forms of modern slavery. A, forced marriage. B, debt bondage. C, unpaid overtime. D, servitude, or E, all of them? Well, you might be wondering, the audience, what is modern slavery in the first place? Is that like slavery that happens to white-collar workers or something, you know, that happens to workers in office? We're going to talk about that. But for now, let's see from your own understanding about this. Another 10 seconds. Okay, so most of you say all of the above, which is again correct. All right, thank you so much. So it seems that it's either you understand about the terms or you just lightly guess because the previous question, right? But we are going to talk about that later. So the last question, the conditions that might trigger modern slavery. Is it A, family debt, B, cultural beliefs, C, migration, or D, marrying foreigner, and E, all of them? So conditions that might trigger, potentially, not always, but potentially will trigger modern slavery. Give you another 10 seconds to think about it. All right, cool. So most of you, again, say all of the above, which is the correct answers. Really nice. So yes, we are going to talk about this in-depth discussion. So you might have other thoughts regarding questions, or you might have the different answers, but please save them because the answers might be late within the discussion that we are going to start. All right, so let's get the discussion started. I will start from His Excellency, Eric Paulsen. Eric, to contextualize our discussion today, would you describe ASEAN's stance on human rights?
Thank you, UNSW ASEAN Society, for the kind invitation to speak at this conference. Regarding the question on what is ASEAN's stance on human rights, well, to say the least, ASEAN has a complicated relationship with human rights. ASEAN, as you know, was established in 1967, mainly for cooperation in economic, social, cultural fields and the promotion of peace and stability in the region. Human rights were never a consideration. However, in the 1990s, there were some references to human rights in a number of official statements beginning in 1993. For the first time, a separate section on human rights were incorporated in the 26th ASEAN Ministerial Meeting Joint Communique 1 month after the Vienna World Conference on Human Rights. While in principle, ASEAN accepts the concept of the universality of human rights, however, it also argues that there are differences between international human rights standards and practices in the region. For ASEAN, human rights are shaped by each society's specific history, traditions, cultures, and religion. Further, some ASEAN member states believe that individual rights must give way to the demands of national security and economic growth. They believe that the duties or responsibilities of the state, responsibilities to the state and to other citizens come before the need to respect individual human rights. Despite the contestation of ideas, ASEAN included the concepts of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the ASEAN Charter, which was adopted in 2007. Consensus was achieved with various compromises, including being balanced by the founding ASEAN principles of non-interference in the internal affairs of ASEAN member states and decision-making by consensus, which were repeated in the ASEAN Charter. Despite criticisms by stakeholders, especially from civil society, over the last 3 decades, ASEAN has made tangible progress towards the institutionalization of human rights. They are mainly as follows: the adoption of various ASEAN declarations pertaining to human rights. I can name a few. There's the ASEAN Declaration on the Advancement of Women, the ASEAN Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, ASEAN Declaration Against Trafficking in Persons, ASEAN Declaration on the Protection and the Rights of Migrant Workers, and the ASEAN Declaration on Human Rights in 2012. Of course, we have this Convention Against Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children, ACTIP, which was adopted in 2015. Further, ASEAN has also established the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights in 2009. So that's a commission which I belong to. And the ASEAN Commission on the Rights of Women and Children in 2010. As for the international ratification of core international human rights treaties, only 3 conventions, the CRC on the rights of the child, CEDAW, the rights of women, and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, CRPD, have been ratified by all ASEAN member states. However, as a whole, generally, the number of ratification of international human rights instruments by ASEAN member states have generally been high. Despite these advances, as is well known, ASEAN member states generally have a cautious stance towards human rights. There is a persistent concern between the potential erosion of state sovereignty and the demands for better human rights standards. This uncertain commitment to human rights leads to a somewhat confused regional outlook, as well as a weakness in the substantive practice of human rights in the region. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. So you mentioned about the difference on the countries because we have different cultures, religions, beliefs, and stuff. So it might influence how we control modern slavery and other abuses on workers' rights. That's really interesting points. We are going to talk about a deeper discussion about this. But before that, we are going to talk about a new terms which was introduced during the quiz, which is the modern slavery. I would like to ask Stephen about this. This term is being used in businesses and other places, but we think that it is a relatively new term. Stephen, what is the difference between modern slavery and other mistreatments in general?
Great, thanks, Simon. It's a pleasure to be here. So look, modern slavery is a term which is yet to have an agreed definition internationally, except perhaps to differentiate it from more ancient forms or traditional forms of slave labor, for example, in the transatlantic slave trade. It's a term which has been adopted by governments, both in the Australian government and the UK government, to capture a range of human rights abuses around extreme forms of labor violations that are often transactional or financial by nature. So this includes slavery, forced labor, extreme forms of child labor. It includes domestic servitude, debt bondage, human trafficking, forced marriage, and deceptive recruitment. And these abuses are often clustered so that a person who experiences debt bondage may then be trafficked into a situation of forced labour, for instance. So they don't often sit in isolation. When compared with other mistreatments, modern slavery sits at the extreme end of the spectrum where the worst forms of exploitation occur, where a person's rights, for example, to move or choose or speak out is restricted or severely limited. There are a number of indicators of modern slavery, such as underpay or no pay, excessive work hours, unsafe work conditions, including the facility or unsafe machinery, poor air quality, poor water quality. There could be excessive onboarding fees and fines for mistakes or minor offences. Short-term contracts and the identity documents are often withheld. So there's a range of violations there. On their own, each of these issues don't necessarily constitute a state of slavery. So a migrant worker may experience wage theft or the lack of jobs. This doesn't necessarily mean it's a state of slavery. It's more to do when you put enough of these indicators together, then the case for modern slavery increases.
Thank you so much, Stephen. So that's it. I think like one of the highlights of your explanation is that modern slavery captures a wide variety or spectrum of which can't be categorized as slavery in general. So that's really nice. Eric also previously mentioned about uncertainty because different areas in ASEAN might implement different degree of control to this issue. So the next question I would like to ask Justin, how well is ASEAN doing with addressing labor and migrant workers' rights issues within the areas? Justin, please.
Thanks so much, Darman, and it's nice to speak to everybody. That's a difficult issue because, as Eric noted at the start, that ASEAN, like other regional blocs, is made up of all these different countries and all these different approaches. So when you say how well is it doing, really you've got to understand how well each country is doing within that. People will often say, how well is the United Nations doing, or why doesn't the United Nations act? But that's 193 countries, and you have to look at how they're operating differently. So as a bloc, there have been a number of stances they've taken, which Eric outlined, the advances and progress that have been made around human rights and statements and protocols, directives that have been passed. But if I was sort of putting a really, critical hat on, I might also say that there is tended to be an approach sometimes that is quite top-down, trying to solve a problem through various policies. But in addressing modern slavery, it's very much a sort of you've got to take a 360-degree, look at it. So you've got to bring not only international institutions, you have to bring in national governments, you have to bring in business, you have to bring in communities and civil society and trade unions. So if you're asking how well it's doing, you're then asking how well is it engaging with all of those groups. Be a mixed record on that. It's doing a good job at setting some policies from the top down, but not also working to incentivize change and transform change or incorporate worker views and worker voice in relation to that, or support civil society with it. I think it also has had an overly criminal justice approach to some of these issues. So looking at it as a criminal problem, as opposed to sometimes a workplace problem, a community problem, a business problem. So I think there's some steps forward, but I do think that there's a lot of work to be done in ASEAN. The Asia Pacific region has the largest number of people who are currently trapped in modern slavery in the world. So clearly we have a lot of work to do in the larger region, even beyond ASEAN.
Thank you so much, Justin. You highlight that we have to elaborate a lot of stakeholders to justify whether ASEAN is in a good control of the issues or not. I would like to ask Joyce about this. Joyce, do you have additional perspectives on what Justin just explained? Sorry, you might want to unmute yourself. Thank you.
Certainly. Thank you. And I can't claim I'm the expert. We have lots of experts in this panel. But from Unforest's perspective, we represent the buyers, retailers, and also the supply chain. certainly we have over 4 decades of trading relationship with Asian countries. So there are some perspectives I would like to supplement here, and that could be of reference of people who are interested in the topic and get together and work together to improve the situation. Why Amphori think this issue is important and to us? Back to year 2003, we received many requests from our members who trade and source from multiple countries. Out of, say, all sourcing countries, 6 out of 10 member states of ASEAN countries are our top sourcing countries. So they supply goods in 21 sectors, mainly from fast-moving consumer goods. And many of those have SMEs. They might not have, say, sufficient resources to understand or comply to global standards or even local laws in terms of things like to avoid forced labors. So I just try to express our respect to what Eric just mentioned. In more than 4 decades of observation and trading experience, we do welcome very much the ASEAN member states and governments' efforts in, for example, drawing a big framework through their joint declaration, like back to year 2000, as Eric just mentioned, the Asean Declaration on Protection and Promotion of Rights of Migrant Workers. And they also have, say, in 2017, also developed this ASEAN Consensus on the Protection and Promotion of the Rights of Migrants. And according to ILO's latest report published in 2021, ASEAN has issued 162 recommendations on migrant workers policies for member states between year 2010 and 2019. So in terms of setting up directions and framework, but on voluntary basis, it can't be mandatory because of the disparity of and diversity of development pace of these economic clusters. So we fully respect that. And throughout all the efforts of member states, we also see they have identified some clusters for, say, a standardization or collaboration, such as pre-departure or post-arrival orientation for migrant workers, such as equal access to social protection. They are all very welcome by our buyers, members, retailers who are very remote to the ground. You know, they can only reach our first tier supplies most of the time. And things in the upstream of the supply chain, we rely very much on government's support to monitor the social risk. So in this regard, we appreciate very much. And we also have some examples, say, see the development. I just quote one example from the biggest import of labors within the region, Thailand. We have a very close relationship with Ministry of Commerce from Thai government. Back in year 2000, around 14 to 16, we were approached by the Thai government to introduce a series of training for factories and food and non-food in Thailand who supply goods to members of the European Union. The topic was responsible recruitment, because by that time, many disclosure of forced labor in fisheries industry or say cause attention from CSOs and multi-stakeholders. So we were pleased to be invited to engage because we have more than a decade of experience providing capacity building program for business who supply goods to our buyers. So Thailand is also the first ASEAN country introduced the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, which since 2019. In the past 2 years, Amphori has been frequently engaged in the process of making the implementation more realistically and implementable in the supply chain. So, and there are certainly challenges recently we observe because of COVID-19. And the other country I want to mention here is Vietnam. Vietnam is our top of the 10 ASEAN countries supply goods to our members. You saw this European Union free trade agreement with Vietnam became effective last year, finally, after several years of efforts. And they have a very dedicated chapter called Sustainability Chapter. And most of the CSR requirement is to prevent and remediate forced labor issues. And Untitled actually is the biggest contributor in this chapter during the consultation process when they prepared the draft of the free trade agreement. So back to 2019, we also have a roundtable discussion with multiple Vietnamese government and stakeholders, and involving UN agency like International Organization Migration, IOM. And they are our close partners to jointly address issues about forced labor in this big cluster. So these are the examples. But having said that, we are happy to see the progress. We also see some areas of improvement through our more than a decade of social audits. So we have 11 code of principles that are developed with reference to ILO conventions, UN guiding principles for business and human rights, and the OECD guidance. And we respect local laws. So the challenges is how can we address the same issues with different, say, capacities of governments and resources of business. This is the reason why we are here today. We would like to listen from different parties, and so that we can explore forum that we can address the issues together. In fact, tomorrow I've been invited by a group of stakeholders from Malaysia to discuss the guidance for SMEs. How can we address the recruitment fee issues that always happen in the exploitation of migrant workers in the region? So it would be our contribution to address the issue. And this is, my highlights of today, according to your questions. Of course, there are rooms of improvement like the policies. We hope to see more collaboration between different ASEAN member states and governments.
All right, thank you very much, Joyce. You mentioned that ASEAN in nature, usually they are outsourcing countries. So that's why we are more prone to foreign slavery and stuff. And also some of the businesses don't really understand about how to do the good practice of business and stuff. That's a highlight of like how complex the problem is, because as Stephen explained about the nature of the modern slavery, it contains like a wide spectrum, so it can be categorized with a lot of like complexity. So the next questions that I would like to ask to all of the speakers would be, what is the main reasons or the root causes for these problems to occur? Because Justine mentioned previously, she really well explained that it involves a lot of like stakeholders. So it's really complex. So we would like to understand, based on your experience, what is the root cause of these problems? Maybe we can start from Mr. Eric.
Thank you. Just to add on to what Joyce has said. So the current prevalence of trafficking persons, so I'm going to use the term trafficking persons rather than modern slavery, because this is more commonly used within ASEAN. It's not for a lack of regulation. There are numerous global and regional initiatives to combat trafficking persons, which have been ratified or followed by a number of ASEAN member states. At the sub-regional level, the coordinated Mekong Ministerial Initiative Against Trafficking that has led to several bilateral agreements aimed at greater cooperation between the states in the greater Mekong region. Beyond Southeast Asia, the Bali process was set up in 2002 as a platform for dialogue among countries in the Asia Pacific. Its goal is to raise awareness and build capacity to combat human smuggling, trafficking, and transnational crime. However, the general consensus in ASEAN and ASEAN member states, there has been a tendency to conflate irregular migration with TIP, although that is slowly changing. Victims of TIP are often viewed through the framework of national security or border protection, thus diverting focus away from the protection of victims. Such discourse is problematic because it hinders the development of comprehensive anti-TIP frameworks and the handling of the serious human rights abuses associated with TIP. Despite regional and national initiatives, TIP remains underreported, underdetected, and underprosecuted. It remains largely a hidden crime since victims are reluctant to seek help for fear of reprisals from the perpetrators, but also penalties from law enforcement authorities. Victims, not perpetrators, are often the ones who suffer the brunt of illegal migration and other offenses as a result of the trafficking. Further, law enforcement agencies lack the skills, knowledge, and resources to understand and respond to the evolving complexities of TIP. Collusion between corrupt government officials and criminal networks is another serious problem. We only need to highlight the gruesome discovery of mass graves of trafficking victims along the Thai-Malaysian border in 2015 to point to such collusion. The subsequent trials exposed a matrix of collusion between state officials, including a Thai army general, local police, and other officials, including a mayor in Songkhla, and businessmen who profited from the trafficking. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. So that's really a long list of problems, right? I catch some conflicting or irregular laws, different laws, and then underreported because the victims are afraid to report it because of, they don't want to be blamed or to pay extra fines and stuff like that, and also the corruption. Stephen, would you like to add more perspective on that?
Sure. I think the context of modern slavery occurs out of lack of opportunities, perhaps education, and particularly when people cross borders, they become vulnerable due to lack of understanding around culture or workplace laws, or what are the rights and wrongs, what are the rules of engagement in a particular jurisdiction. I think sometimes that can also it can arouse out of a sense of opportunism. So I know, for example, during my work in Spain, in Europe, there was a sense of opportunism for people thinking, and a trend from east to west and from south to north. If I can only get to Paris, London, Berlin, Zurich, Madrid, then that where the streets are lined with gold, then there's going to be an opportunity and I'm going to get a job. And unfortunately, I think a lot of instances occur in that sense when people's dreams go sour and then they're made vulnerable and the risk of being exploited. And I think just with the prevalence of organized crime groups ready to intercept and people to step in to engage those people and force them into work which they didn't sign up to in the first place. So that's a dynamic at work here.
Thank you, Stephen. So you mentioned about lack of understanding from people who want to work outside of their countries, and also sense of opportunism or a desire to find better life outside of their original areas, and also organized crime from certain groups. That's really concerning. All right, Justin, would you like to add some more perspectives on that?
Sure. I mean, all of the points that made sort of do get to those root causes, but I guess I would like to emphasize a couple. I mean, we've talked about sort of a lack of education or understanding, but the root causes around poverty, inequality, discrimination, and so that's what's leading to this situation, and corruption, as Eric mentioned. But modern slavery is not accidental. This is not, sort of just someone forgetting to pay someone and there's an underpayment of wages. It's serious exploitation, at a really high level. So it's not merely a lack of education on the part of the victim or the worker. It's a deliberate move. And we have talked about government's responsibility, but we haven't always focused on business. So part of the problem with particularly something like forced labor, in agriculture, in supply chains, is the business model itself. So it's from the very top, the brands that may be located in a different region, in a different country, but may also be located within ASEAN. And there's this downward pressure on price throughout the company. And at the bottom of that downward pressure is the worker. And so it's that sort of chain which can then lead to forced labor and exploitation, which equates to modern slavery. So it's not, it's not something that just might accidentally happen to someone. And the other thing I just want to mention is that we've sort of mentioned culture a couple of times, and every country in the world has different cultures, and within that country, there are variants around that culture. But culture can never be used to limit a person's rights, to look at it as an excuse for someone not having human rights. And that includes the right to work in decent and humane conditions. And so culture may affect how fast a country moves or the implementation of that right, but culture cannot be used as an excuse not to respect someone's basic dignity. And that's what's happening with modern slavery, is that we are not acknowledging that everybody has a right to dignity, and culture isn't sort of an out for that. So I want to sort of remind people that modern slavery exists in Australia and in every country in the world. So it's not a question of developing countries versus developed countries, global north, global south. It is everywhere. And it's perpetuated by our business models and the approaches that we take.
Thank you so much, Justin. That's a really strong explanation. That is not about employers, but it's also about employees, but it's also about business motives and the business models. That's really interesting. Joyce, do you have other perspectives to add on this?
Yeah, I do. I just want to echo to what Justin just mentioned. When I took up the position at Untitled 10 years ago, and we always identify risk countries, or where do you source, and those are risk countries. But since 2015, when we enhanced our code of conduct for members, and we start to change the term to country risk. Every country has different level of risk. Yeah, and I would like to address the root causes by nature of a supply chain. The supply side, migrants, they move away from the hometown, home countries, and home cities. And why? And the multiple reasons have been mentioned just now. So by nature, migrants working away from their hometown or home country are already vulnerable. That means they can accept lower terms compared with the country of destination, because they try to remain competitive and find better opportunities. It doesn't limit to only uneducated workers. I have seen real life experience of very, very educated experts who have lots of international experience and coming from South Asian countries, working in UK, still having a very, very low pay, not just because she's from Asia, but also because she's a woman. So I think we're talking about at vice president level. So I think this kind of things we shouldn't underestimate and limit our scope and just focusing on production sites. We also have lots of forced labor in service industry, but quite often I find many people or say reports are focusing on talking about the problems, but not addressing the root cause. By nature, the country of destination are in favor of importing laborers for good and bad reasons, because nobody in the country like to do certain kind of jobs. So the migrants should be treated as assets. They are the one who support developed economy, and but quite often become the unfavorable, receiving unfavorable treatment. This is a very interesting and ironic. So we have to change our lens when we talk about the supply and demand side. By nature, yes, it created some maybe lower terms or unfavorable treatment by nature compared with different countries. We have to remind ourselves all the time when we set up the laws, when we look at the countries, even for example, I took the example in ASEAN countries, but not limited to ASEAN countries. We find many laws are existing and involved. However, integration of different laws between countries quite often not that easy to manage. So we find, say, migrants, we talk about, take an example, payment of recruitment fee for migrant workers. And I asked IOM, what's the ideal situation? How can people comply? And then they said, ideally is a payback. Oh, since the factory established is 20 years ago, all the migrant workers, if they return to home country, you should pay back all the recruitment fee. How can we do it? It's difficult. And even they have the money. How can we track and trace those workers who were from Nepal and work in Malaysia? Maybe they are shipped to transfer to another third country. So how can we reach out the third country? So I mean, all these things can be very idealistic. I just want to also making the point here, the root causes of some barriers of avoiding exploitation is we need more coordinated approach, not just within ASEAN, but beyond that with other collaboration trading partner countries. And another point I want to add on to that is the definition of modern slavery has been evolving. Apart from the cultural difference Justin has highlighted, I think it's important is the definition of exploitation or say abuse. For example, in the past, maybe we just talk about minimum wage, and then we talk about living wage, fair recruitment, and fair responsible recruitment. Everything is becoming more sophisticated. But whether the competence and capacity of business players or service provider can cater, we need to pay more attention to that. Otherwise, we can only put things in black and white, but not really making it happen in real life. And the most invisible weakest link in the supply chain for exploitation causing this, recruitment agency is one of those. Quite often we mention about policy, but they were very, very lowly engaged. Let me put it this way. So I think we need to extend our scope of engagement, not just CSO, not just producers, suppliers, or buyers, brands, or say government holders. Certain actors in the supply chain have been not fully engaged. That caused some of the exploitation can never be resolved. So these are the few examples I would like to add on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joyce, for your views on the stakeholders wise or the supply chain. The weakest link will create another problem. And also you mentioned about the culture, which also has been discussed by Justin. Culture is not an excuse to make these things going really nice. Okay, cool. So that concludes our first round of the discussion. We already got the reasons or the root causes why this issue happens. The next round of the discussion, we are going to talk about the ideal solutions from the perspectives of our speakers. But before we do that, we are going to introduce a case study, which will test your understanding, the audience, your understanding about the topics which is discussed. So the case study would be on the top of your screen again, on the right top of your screen, but I'll also explain this one. So this is the case study. Imagine the case where an ASEAN migrant worker leaves their home country to work elsewhere, but illegally and without proper documentation. Unfortunately, in the destination country, they are charged a recruitment fee to get the job. And this puts them into a massive debt and forcing them to work for little or even no pay to repay that debt. That's really sad, but that's a sad truth. And they are found by a local government, but have no documentation. So they are forced to send home with less money that they arrive with. So their condition now is worse. This is the correct thing to do. So this is the question. This is the correct thing to do because their work was illegal in the first place. Do you agree with this? So the first one, strongly agree, disagree, neutral, agree, or strongly agree. Because this is a bit complicated compared to our first quiz. So I'll give you maybe 15 seconds to think about it. Some of people might think that, wow, that's a really long case study, but we still need a lot of justifications. Yes, but based on this one, we can discuss about it later. We just want to see your opinion. Okay, so we already got the result of the poll, and most of the audience say strongly disagree, which is really interesting. So I would like to ask Justin about this.
Yes, I mean, it is a really complicated issue, but it's not an unusual problem. That this is often quite common with migrant workers in this case. But one of the questions that you ask at the start is, they moved illegally, and so I'm saying, well, what does that mean? What do you mean they left illegally? Often what you see with recruitment fees is that the recruitment fees is often paid in the country before they leave through a series of recruitment agents. And it might be someone they know in their village or their area where they're working, that first step of recruitment fee is being paid. That's the first bit of illegal, generally. I mean, and what you have to think about often with distinction between migrant workers and, say, white-collar workers, that recruitment fees are often paid with white-collar worker type situations, but it's paid by an employer to an agency, and that relationship is covered by the employer. What happens in the case here with migrant workers is that fee is pushed down to the worker, which is against the conventions of the International Labour Organization. But as Joyce says, it's very complicated in the region in terms of what's required and what's allowed at domestic levels. So you have to look at, whether there was sort of that control and push of the worker. Were they promised a job that was not the job that they would end up getting there? Were they deceived actually in their home country? And so, that the problem started way back there before they got to the destination country. And then you have a situation where they're basically working without pay to repay the debt. And this then gets into one of the situations which we'd classify it as forced labour under the International Labour Organization. To then, for a government agency to then send that worker home and sort of dismiss them and move the problem back would go against what the ILO would recommend. So the international recommendations would set up this repatriation scheme, compensation scheme in their own country. And so the scenario that you're showing here is that there are multiple stages of where things went wrong, and that there are likely multiple stages of business being involved, recruitment agencies, government agencies, both governments in both countries are sort of handling this in a situation which would be against international law in cases.
Thank you so much, Justin. Eric, do you have any other perspectives to add?
Yeah, thank you. Just to add on what to what Professor Justin has said. I mean, there are various scenarios. So one, it could be a situation, migrant workers from neighboring countries. They just clandestinely, they just come by themselves through the sea, for example, and then they just come to Malaysia, for example, and then they just started working. But there are other circumstances whereby people could be a bit far away, could be from Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, or even Indonesia or the Philippines, and then they get recruited in villages, and they pay quite a large amount of sum as part of the recruitment fees. And of course, a lot of these people, they are quite poor. Some of them go in debt because they need to borrow money in order to pay the recruitment fees. Some of them need to sell their land. And then, once they come to a country like Malaysia or even Thailand or Singapore, sometimes, they feel so helpless, right? Technically, they are in the country legally for a while, but once they're here, so sometimes, their passport gets confiscated, they are put on a temporary visa, or the work as promised is just not there. Right, and they're paid lower amount that is promised. If you have a single employer, it's probably fine. Then you get a fixed pay. But sometimes you get, transferred to one particular area. You get work there for 20 days, and then you don't get to work for another several days, and then they move you to another place for another. You work for another 2 weeks and 3 weeks. So what happens is now this particular migrant worker would have incurred so much of expenses, and now they are in a strange country. Where they're at the mercy of their agents, right? And basically, they are now at the mercy of these people. So what happened is there should be a stronger victim protection mandate as to forcibly deport them back to their home countries would certainly not resolve the matter. However, I think most states still favor deportation as they are concerned that a stronger victim protection system would lead to abuse of such a system. This must, of course, be challenged because a stronger provision can only enable more effective prosecution of traffickers, since this would increase the likelihood of victims coming forward to assist authorities in investigation and judicial proceedings. Lastly, I'd like to add that there's also a need to help victims to overcome the trauma and stigma associated with trafficking and to build trust in law enforcement, so that victims seek help and cooperate in prosecuting traffickers. They should be supported instead of being penalized by deportation with nothing to show for despite all the expenses, work, and suffering. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric and Justin. You already explained that this is, the problem from this scenario is that this is a combinations between employees who don't really understand about the regulations and their rights, and also the employers who actually do something very fishy there. I just want to reconfirm that Eric and Justin mentioned that the approach to deport them is not usually a good thing, but in some cases, that's what happened. But we have a lot of chances to improve the conditions. Cool. All right, so that's the case study discussion. Now let's move to our second session, our last discussion before the Q&A. I once again remind all of the audience to ask any questions in the chat room provided. Cool. So previously in the first round of the discussion, we already talked about the root causes, which is really complex and it's really complicated, but let's talk about this. Clearly, the issue of the modern slavery and the labor and migrant abuse are very serious. Given the difficulty of monitoring and stopping these abuses, as we already talked before, what can be done to better detect migrant and labor abuse? And what are the roles of various stakeholders from businesses, consumers, governments, and also ASEAN itself? Maybe we can start from Justin.
Sure, thanks. I mean, this is a huge question. So I'll just take one part and then I'll let other people pick up on other aspects of it, because this is sort of very much one of those things where you need multiple levers in order to create change. So the area I would focus on is around the empowerment of workers on this issue. Because too often when we're trying to deal with an issue like this, we're focused on dealing with top-down policies or changes, whether it's from a government or at from a business as well. But what we overlook many times is listening to the worker and giving them the ability to speak up. So recognizing the right for a worker to join a trade union and to be heard. Recognizing a relationship a worker might have with a civil society group, an NGO who is supporting them, and finding a way in the process to bring those groups in. Because this change is only going to be created if you're sort of, doing it in a complete circle, if you like. And I think there can be too much focus on law and regulation and policy changes, and not enough on what are we doing at the ground level to actually address working conditions, and are we listening to the people who are most impacted? So the victims of modern slavery, the forced laborers, they are the people we need to think about how we better empower them and enable them to have a voice to deal with change. And part of that is recognizing the ability and the role of trade unions, and also supporting civil society to enable them to increase their voice.
Thank you so much, Justin. So you talk about recognizing the rights of the employees and also potential cooperations with NGOs, trade unions, and also civil societies, which is really interesting. I would like to ask Stephen, what is your perspective on this, Stephen?
Sure, yeah, I mean, I concur with Justine that, yeah, there's many levers here, so I'll just also pick a couple myself. I think I'll speak probably from the side of business as actors at the top, but also businesses as consumers as well, and that will dovetail into the consumer bit. There's lots of things, obviously, that businesses can do, first of all, to adhere to business as human rights guidelines, and for example, in Australia, for those companies to adhere to the Modern Slavery Act and make a really good effort to put in policies and frameworks that actually are going to have traction down through the supply chain, for example, of the organization, and not just to look good, to the public or to the government. So I think part of that, though, is actually being willing to invest in the right tools and the right expertise, to invest in recruiting the right resources and the right consultation to actually understand what those risks are, and to really hone down on what they can actually do and where they can leverage their influence in the space, because that'll vary from business to business in terms of what they can actually do. I think there's a part, and the investment too, I think, is also investing in technologies that can increase traceability and transparency, and the use of big data and blockchain technologies that can actually really monitor what's going on at a transactional level, and what can be controlled through transactions in the supply chain. So I think there's a lot that can be done in terms of investment. Second, I think there's the role of collaboration, and so second to technology, and particularly technologies which are predictive in terms of where they think incidents of modern slavery or labor abuses are occurring, is to actually form really good resilient partnerships with suppliers, and to use their influence and their position to actually to train and equip and resource suppliers. In terms of my work that I do with Australian businesses, both large and small, there is a tension and a mounting temptation with the legislation to overlook perhaps or just use a self-assessment questionnaire as an excuse that, oh, I've done what I need to do to fulfill the requirements of the Modern Slavery Act. I've issued, an SAQ to my top 50 or my top 200 suppliers, and this is the information I've got. And I think there's a real temptation there to think, oh, well, we won't really spend too much time investigating or analysing that data and thinking through, oh, actually, what are the opportunities for that supplier to then go to the next level through the supply chain. And particularly, I think there's a temptation there where there's a really strong relationship between a business and a supplier that's, say, 10, 15, 20 years old. And for all intents and purposes, it's a very functional and working relationship. Why would I as a business perhaps want to disrupt that? Because, and exclude that company because they're not necessarily ticking all the boxes that I'm also trying to tick as well. So I think having a structure in there where it's not just about issuing SAQs or doing an audit, but actually working with suppliers to actually understand the issues and working and encouraging them and resourcing them to go down the supply chain in a relational sense as much as through technology or some sort of transaction. I think, in addition to that, I think there needs to be a greater emphasis on ethical sourcing and what we are producing. So to actually think through, the products that we actually are making ourselves or importing, and making more responsible decisions. So, and that obviously then touches on what consumers can do. And I think whilst there are some efforts in that area and some successes, I think a lot more could be done for both consumers and businesses as consumers to understand the issues, which can be manifold, obviously, in terms of the production of a t-shirt, for example. There's lots of levers involved in the production of all sorts of products, but to think seriously through how we can source better and how we can encourage our suppliers to produce more ethically as well.
Thank you so much, Stephen. You mentioned about the implementation of technology, which is really interesting because internally, we at UNSW ASEAN communities also discuss about that. And that's a really big topic because the complexity is a different discussion. But this is really interesting. You also mentioned about the collaborations and the good governance on the company's ethical sourcing. I would like to ask Joyce next. Joyce, do you have additional perspectives on that? You might want to unmute yourself. Okay.
Fortunately, I do. You will be amazed because so many good things have been mentioned. I still have a few to add. Allow me to suggest one for each as you list there the stakeholders like government, business, NFP, consumers. Governments, I have already mentioned. I think within government, apart from what I mentioned about better coordinated efforts or between governments, I think it is important to address the issue why the country of destination need to import migrants. Is that the only solution? Do we have other options? Can also protect migrants or refugees better? I have been told and questioned by many business, people who need to import migrant workers, where actually within the country have lots of refugees, or say undocumented illegal migrants, but have been settled down for many years. They're not allowed, according to law, not allowed to receive education, not allowed to work, but they are living there, but then committed to crimes. Do we have a better policy to create a protection for these people to resolve those productivity issues? This is one of the perspectives I would like to address here. Say governments, collaboration doesn't limit to intergovernment or within the government, within the country. We can also review what caused the need for importing labors. And the second one is business collaboration. I think many have been talking about, yes, we need many professional expertise and investment to resolve those problems. But you will be amazed actually in our, say, Unfory SCI's system, we do have members, buyers transfer knowledge to producers to resolve overtime work issues. For example, we have a Thai producers of baby products, and they have a Dutch buyers, and then they have been non-compliant for 4 consecutive years in overtime work because they want to pay more for the workers and comply to the order fulfillment. And then the Dutch member volunteered to send 2 engineers to their factory. It's a family-run business. Within 1 month, they try to arrange the production line without additional investment. They resolved the overtime work already. And we have a Swedish buyer transfer the knowledge of HR management, sending a few dedicated staff to a frozen food suppliers in China, for example, and then they learn how to set up a proper HR management system. This kind of thing doesn't actually incur additional costs in the supply chain, but build trust, knowledge transfer, and address the issues together. And the third one is for NFP. Say non-profit making organization, for example. I think like us, we are joint initiative. We do organize program and subsidize program or jointly collaborate with different parties in different countries to run a women empowerment program. We are successfully training up some factories in Asian countries in the supervisor level, how to handle, say, sexual harassment issues involving migrant workers in Asia. So I think this kind of thing, we at Unfory, being a global initiative, can also help. And we are also doing pilots now in one Asian countries to help them to identify remediation plan of a recruitment fee. How can we make it acceptable to all while we can't be ideal? So this kind of thing is important. The last but not least is the role of consumers. Australia is a new membership growth country in our Unfory network. Why? Because many Australian companies have been committed to comply to the Modern Slavery Act introduced by the government back to 2 or 3 years ago. And we see the needs, and we need to change being consumers. I won't say they, I will say we, being the consumers. Our members from Australia are mainly retailers, buyers, importers. And I think they act on behalf of consumer to do sourcing. If being the consumer, we buy things from Australian retail shops, if we don't wear the lens that, oh, migrant workers might be associated with forced labor automatically, that could give them an option and the opportunity for the supply chain actor not to be shy or hesitate to disclose the problems. Then things will become more transparent. We should avoid finger pointing, say, to companies who can't do better or not good enough yet. So being consumers have the key role to play. Don't wear lens and give opportunities, be open-minded when we look at problems. Then the retailers can work better and make the supply chain with the suppliers more transparent. And the issue we talk about, I have been asked to talk about ASEAN countries more, but the situation can be improved by international cooperation too. So I do have a colleague, the country rep based in Sydney, Antonio, who is attending the session also today. He works also closely with the National Retailers Association and the different stakeholders. I also personally met the Australian Embassy representative and customer, the custom in charge in Brussels. Our president also visited Australia. I would like to see more this kind of crossover collaborations to address the issues from 360 degrees perspective rather than, fragmented. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joyce. That's a really good discussion on that. I would like to ask Eric.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I just like to advocate for structure, as stronger provisions will enable the effective prosecution of traffickers, since this would increase the likelihood of tip victims coming forward. I would propose the following, but of course, depending on the respective national framework. One, the assistance to tip victims should be framed as a guaranteed right instead of discretionary. The scope of aftercare assistance to victims of TIP should also be enhanced, for example, beyond providing shelter and counseling, but extended to medical treatment, interpretation needs, financial and legal assistance. Thirdly, this is the most important. Victims should be allowed to work while investigations are ongoing. There should be a temporary right to work, since investigations and legal proceedings may take years before they are resolved, during which time most victims of TIP are obliged to remain in the country. Fear of loss of income may prevent victims of TIP from coming forward. Fourth, there should be protection against TIP victims from being charged for migration-related offences or other offences as a result of the trafficking. Fifth, there should be a right for the safe return of victims after the legal proceedings have concluded. Lastly, there should be provision of compensation and restitution to TIP victims, for example, to allow confiscation of property or assets so as to compensate victims or for them to be channeled into a common fund. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. Okay, actually, I would like to review some of the descriptions that has been told by the speakers, but unfortunately, we are running out of time. So maybe we can move to Q&A now, and then at the end of the session, I would like to review some of the discussion. All right, let me see the questions that we got here. All right, the first question. Some countries are bringing in national laws for businesses to reduce modern slavery in supply chains. Will or should ASEAN countries do the same? How will or how could ASEAN countries' governments leverage protecting the rights of seafarers in the region with business? Thank you. So it's talking about bringing national laws for businesses to reduce modern slavery in supply chains. So maybe because it's related to supply chains, Joyce, do you have any thoughts on this? Let me reiterate the questions. Some countries are bringing in national laws for businesses to reduce modern slavery in supply chains. Should ASEAN countries do the same? How could ASEAN countries' governments leverage protecting the rights of seafarers in the region with the business? Thank you.
Interesting, you pick me first. I would love to also defer part of the questions. Would love to hear from Eric. He is maybe in a better position to speak on behalf of ASEAN countries. However, when I read through these questions, this seems to assume that ASEAN countries may not be doing enough or the same. Although Modern Slavery Act, the name itself has been formally, officially adopted only in a few countries. However, it doesn't mean a country without that such act or laws and regulations naming like modern slavery are doing nothing. As I have already pointed out, shared at the beginning of my presentation, we have seen different countries has committed to improve in different areas. So from the supply chain perspectives, some of those improvements cannot be just rely on laws, because laws is the requirement and is the regulation to regulate your behavior. However, how can we prevent and remediate or say improve, rely on business ourselves disciplines? And so I would not say there are whatever things are not good enough yet must be the government's responsibility. And however, we have seen the framework have been there, direction have been set. Different countries, we should respect, they have different pace to do, address the most highest priority they can have. And I'm not from ASEAN countries and I cannot speak on behalf of the governments. However, we have been doing a lot to engage the governmental relations side, say different authorities, to try to understand the priorities and address the issues together, and then make some resources available where our network allowed to improve. So this would be more sustainable than just relying on, say, recently we have seen, say, the EU has introduced the forced labor guidance. It's voluntary, not mandatory. Say Germany has introduced the supply chain law. And I invited my German colleagues to explain to me, how can you really make it happen while we have so many complexities in the supply chain? And there are lots of rooms, even you set up the laws and regulations, as Eric I have already said, we have lots of laws and regulations already. It's a matter of how can we make it really enforced. Is more important than just making everyone have the same wordings of the law available. That's my humble opinion. I hope things can be self-driven, that more take the lead, and government can only set the framework or direction or put resources priority. We are the one who implement it. Yeah, thank you. I don't know whether I can address that, but I see the problems, the solution from different ways. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. Eric, maybe you have additional opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, it is complicated because ASEAN is made out of 10 countries, and each country has got their own national framework, and different countries has got different capabilities in terms of addressing this particular issue. And certainly, as Joyce has pointed out, it's not for really the one of regulations. I think most countries, no country within ASEAN and also would say that, look, we support modern slavery or trafficking. No, each country would say that this is wrong. But the issue is how do you identify these problems? Because most of the time, these countries, they rely on migrant workers. So and then there's the issue as to whether how do these migrant workers, are they victims of trafficking or modern slavery? How do these people get identified, right? So this is where I think public information campaign trainings with the relevant stakeholders at all levels, right? We are talking about, medical authorities, the police, the customs, businesses, and they must want to identify, yes, there is a potential problem here. Let's investigate, let's query, right? And then, and hence my general trust is that we shouldn't look at this issue from the perspective of security or border control. This is about, people coming to a country far away to work, right? Most of the time they want to work legally. No one wants to work illegally, right? If they have a choice. So, but because of the circumstances on how maybe they're tricked, or some of them have no choice but to come to a particular country, in an irregular manner. All right, but no one is out there to commit genuine crimes. They're there to work, but consequently, because of the circumstances, they have been, reduced to modern slavery. So we must be able to protect them. So now the issue is, how the state structures are able to identify and protect them. And this is where, the business community, the public, everyone plays a role. So it's not so simple as, more laws, more policies, therefore everything will fall in place. Thank you.
Yeah. Allow me to supplement one more point. If we really want more rules and regulations, I would like to see more incentives program for those to award those good players, and so that those underperform one and can look up to remain competitive rather than penalty. Penalty doesn't work, and the people will just hide. And if you have incentives, and everyone would be willing to be more open-minded. This may sound a little bit idealistic, but that's how we observe our supply chain improvement in the past decade, when we changed the code of conduct from, say, oh, I'm not allowed to have forced labor, I'm not allowed to have child labor, to become no child labor, no say forced labor. I have the ownership. So then everybody become the driving force of change. Yeah. So I hope if the roles of the government really need those rules and regulation, I hope it could be incentive rather than just increasing the penalty. It's important to have consequence, but incentives can drive things to the positive way also. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joyce. That's really pragmatic suggestion, which is really nice. Reward and punishment. All right. Well, our time is really limited now, so we are going to discuss the last question. This would be addressed to Justin and Stephen. This is the question. Are there any actions being taken against the issue of student exploitation for personal benefit, particularly in research and academia, which appears to be rampant in countries where there are inadequate protections in place for students? For example, students coerced to work for their supervisors without pay and having to oblige in fear of repercussions in the form of demerits. Would this be a form of modern slavery? Justin, maybe you want to start.
Sorry. So again, there's this sort of, there's bad working conditions, there's wage underpayment, there's wage theft, and modern slavery sits on a continuum of exploitation, sitting at the top of that chain. And so underpayment of wages alone may not constitute modern slavery. It's that combination of an indicator like that combined with coercion, control, exploitation of the person. And so it's that combination. But there is absolutely no doubt that there is exploitation of students, domestic and international, in Australia and in other places, that there is wage underpayment in relation to that. And in some cases, that may actually escalate to modern slavery. There are a number of initiatives that have looked at this, and one of my colleagues, Basina Farbenbloom, with her co-author Laurie Berg, have looked at this in several reports that you'll find. If you look at the Migrant Justice Initiative, if you search that up, you'll look at some of their work that is looking at the exploitation of international students and the difficulty of getting compensation for that through often mechanisms like the Fair Work Ombudsman in places like Australia. But this issue happens in Australia. It also happens in countries like ASEAN. But it's sort of, you get caught up in the labor framework in order to seek compensation. Not everything will amount to modern slavery, but some of those circumstances may. But there is a lot of work being done on that issue.
Thank you, Justin. Stephen, do you have any other opinion to add on that?
I can't really comment on terms of any work that's been done on that. I just know of people that I've encountered and conversations I've had with students, particularly those who are coming part-time for study or also coming as seasonal workers. And you know, and it could just be a matter of people not knowing, for example, what their rights are and willing to suffer some level of privation. Could be that they might be underpaid, or they might have to pay for the insurance to pick the fruit to put on the truck, or they might be having to live in accommodation which is not that comfortable, or be fined for all sorts of things that happen. You know, the fridge door breaks and they have to pay a fine for it. So, but they might be willing to suffer that because you know, in order to stay in the country, or because, yeah, to speak up would actually then maybe jeopardize their position in the country. So some young people might be then willing to suffer something for a season, which in order for them to stay in the country and sit on a lovely beach in Australia. So, but that in itself could also be perpetuating the problem because no one is speaking up. So there is no sort of track record or collective voice that's actually bringing that to the attention of the authorities. And so often the case, and I think was raised in that report that you mentioned, Justine, about, you know, a lot of these recruitment agents, you know, they'll liquidate before any investigation can be underway, and then re-emerge as another entity. So it's very difficult then for anyone to actually do any prosecution in this space.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Well, actually, there are a lot of other questions, but unfortunately, our time is up now. So I would like to just conclude our discussion today. The fight against modern slavery and right abuses will need the cooperation between all parties, employees for their understandings about the rights and what is wrong and right, business players, good corporate governance, and also the fairness in business practices, NGOs to help detect this kind of violations. The governments also need to enforce the law and non-conflicting regulations. And the cooperations and reward punishment might be the solutions for all of the problems that we have now. Okay, I would like to thank every speakers for tonight's discussion. Stephen, Joyce, Eric, and also Justin. We really appreciate your contributions and discussions. We are really glad to have you today. Thank you very much.